David, this entire story of sadistic homosexual slayings would almost appear to be fiction, scripted with the full intention of shocking readers over and over again. It's that hard to believe. So many lives involved, so many killed over such a long period of time, and all of it going undetected. But it's not fiction. It's very real. A deadly conspiracy now listed as one of the most horrifying crimes in this century.
What you just heard was the beginning of an investigation that would redefine the meaning of evil in American crime, uncovering a spree that remains one of the largest single-offender murder cases in U.S. history. At the center of this grim discovery was a man who effortlessly blended into the backdrop of the early 1970s American dream, Dean Arnold Corll. Born in 1939, Corll presented a quiet, almost unremarkable figure. He was an electrician by trade, maintaining a small business that required him to move across Houston and its suburbs, giving him both anonymity and access. His true identity, however, was meticulously concealed behind a facade of mundane, suburban reliability. He was often described as shy, reserved, and notably tidy, qualities that immediately worked to disarm any suspicion. The fact that he was unmarried and lived quietly was simply attributed to his reserved nature. Crucially, the local children in the Pasadena neighborhood knew him by a benign nickname, the Candy Man. This moniker, earned because he often handed out sweets to the local kids, cemented his public image as a harmless, slightly eccentric presence. This nickname, now forever linked to unimaginable atrocity, is perhaps the most chilling detail of the entire case, symbolizing the profound, lethal power of misplaced trust. Corll's home in Pasadena, first a house and later an apartment, became the silent hub of his hidden life. It was here that he stored his tools, his equipment, and maintained the outward appearance of a functional life. This domestic setting was meticulously ordered, a crucial element of his psychological makeup. Order was control, and control was paramount to his method. By maintaining a clean, conventional environment, he ensured that the immense darkness he harbored within remained completely invisible to the outside world, creating a perfect, impenetrable sanctuary for his escalating activities. The years between 1970 and 1973 mark the peak of his activities, a time when Corll's profound psychological needs for dominance and control were unleashed. However, unlike many serial perpetrators, Corll quickly realized the immense logistical challenge of his crimes. The scale of the violence he desired required a solution beyond the capabilities of a single individual. This need led him to engage in the most insidious and damaging form of psychological warfare: the systematic exploitation and manipulation of two deeply vulnerable teenagers, David Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley. Brooks and Henley, both young men from troubled backgrounds, did not start as killers, but as victims of Corll's immense, predatory manipulation. Corll offered them what they desperately lacked: attention, a sense of belonging, and crucially, money. In the early 1970s, Corll provided Brooks and Henley with cash, and later, access to his vehicles and apartment. This was not a partnership of equals. It was a deeply coercive and abusive arrangement. Corll utilized his superior age, resources, and psychological insight to exploit their insecurities and their desperate need for acceptance, slowly but surely drawing them into his destructive orbit. The nature of their involvement was insidious. They were not just lookouts, they became recruiters, often luring young men and boys to parties and gatherings, often under false pretenses, where Corll could then gain control. The psychological toll on these two teenagers must have been devastating, forced to live under the constant, crippling weight of Corll's threats and the growing evidence of the horrors he committed. The dynamic was one of total psychological control. Fear, dependency, and the terrifying knowledge of their own complicity became the chains that bound them to Dean Corll. The Houston community's failure to recognize the danger was amplified by the fact that the actual mechanism of abduction was often managed by those who were themselves deeply victimized by the primary killer. This exploitation of the young by the predator is a terrifying testament to the darkness Corll was capable of generating, a darkness that was quietly supported and financed by the money he earned as the friendly, neighborhood electrician, the seemingly harmless Candy Man. This chilling portrait of concealed malice became the defining feature of the Houston mass murders.
The victims were all boys in the early to mid-teens who allegedly had been lured into a death trap by this young man, 17-year-old Elmer Wayne Henley. It was Henley who unveiled this secret of mass killings and led police to the graves of the dead. Henley called the police to the home of Dean Corll. He said he killed that Pasadena resident. Henley said the 34-year-old Corll had talked about killing several young men and burying them in this boat storage in South Houston. Henley said he and two other young people were intended victims Wednesday morning. At that time, they had passed out at Corll's house after an all-night party.
The individual you just saw, Elmer Wayne Henley, was a crucial figure in the mechanism of terror that Dean Corll engineered. He and David Brooks were not merely accessories after the fact. They were the essential architects of compliance, the necessary extension of Corll's immense, predatory will. Understanding the Houston mass murders requires us to look beyond Corll himself, focusing instead on the insidious psychological environment that allowed two troubled teenagers to become active participants in such widespread devastation. This dynamic was rooted in a profound imbalance of power, finance, and psychological vulnerability. Corll meticulously targeted vulnerable youth, specifically Henley and Brooks, offering them something their chaotic lives severely lacked: stability, money, and, critically, a distorted sense of purpose and belonging. In the early 1970s, Corll provided Henley and Brooks with cash payments, sometimes substantial sums, access to vehicles, and, most importantly, the freedom of his private residence. This relationship was not a partnership. It was a carefully constructed system of coercive control. Corll, being older, more financially secure, and profoundly manipulative, used his resources to foster dependency. He exploited their insecurities and their desperate need for acceptance, slowly blurring the lines between companionship and forced complicity. As Corll's impulses escalated, so too did the demands he placed upon his two young collaborators. Brooks and Henley were soon tasked with actively recruiting other young men and boys. This method was essential for Corll's operation to achieve its massive scale. They would lure their victims, often peers, to parties, gatherings, or simply under false promises of money or adventure. This layer of mediation provided Corll with insulation and made the abductions far easier. No one would suspect a casual gathering orchestrated by teenagers. The horrific truth is that many of the victims likely arrived trusting their acquaintances, completely unaware of the deadly trap that awaited them inside Corll's various residences across Houston and Pasadena. The system was horrifyingly efficient. Victims were often brought to Corll's residences, primarily his home or a rented apartment, where the atrocities took place. The psychological toll on Henley and Brooks during this period must have been catastrophic. They were forced to maintain a paralyzing silence, bound by the constant, crippling weight of Corll's threats and the terrifying knowledge of their own deepening complicity. The fear of exposure and the dread of being labeled accomplices, or worse, becoming victims themselves, were the chains that bound them to Dean Corll. The environment was sustained by a mixture of financial incentive and sheer terror, a perverse survival mechanism where their own safety was predicated on their obedience to the Candyman. As the body count mounted and the missing persons reports piled up across Houston, Corll was faced with an immense logistical problem: disposal. The scale of the violence demanded places for concealment that would not be easily discovered. Corll began utilizing various locations across the Houston area, including rented boat sheds, remote wooded areas, and ultimately, a rented boat storage unit. He meticulously coordinated the movement and burial of the victims, often forcing Henley and Brooks to assist in these grim logistical tasks. The bodies were frequently concealed in easily transportable canvas bags or covered with quicklime before being interred. This process demonstrates not only Corll's methodical nature, but also the terrifying extent of the control he maintained over his two teenage assistants. The local community's failure to recognize the danger was amplified by the way the abductions were managed. Since the victims were often recruited by peers from marginalized communities, those frequently dismissed by law enforcement as runaways or delinquents, the initial police investigation was lethargic and fragmented. There was no immediate public panic, no centralized task force, and the links between the individual disappearances were not made until the end. This systemic oversight and the general environment of social apathy provided Dean Corll with the perfect cover he needed to continue his spree year after year. The entire operation was a chilling portrait of concealed malice, quietly funded and supported by the money he earned as the friendly neighborhood electrician, the seemingly harmless Candyman. This dark, hidden system continued unchecked until the inevitable explosion of violence brought the terror to an abrupt and catastrophic end. The system of manipulation engineered by Dean Corll, relying heavily on the compliance of Elmer Wayne Henley and David Brooks, transformed the Houston suburbs into a hunting ground. The resulting crime spree, spanning 3 intense years, represents one of the most tragic examples of a failure of law enforcement and community vigilance. The victims were predominantly teenage boys, many of whom were already struggling on the fringes of society, making their disappearances tragically easy to overlook by authorities, who often dismissed them as simple runaways. This systemic oversight granted Corll the time and anonymity he required to escalate his terrifying activities exponentially. The earliest confirmed disappearance attributed to Corll dates back to September 1970, with the case of Jeffrey Conan. He was the first name on a list that would grow to an unbelievable number. Shortly after, the pattern of abductions began to accelerate. Corll operated with ruthless efficiency, exploiting his various residential locations, each acting as a temporary sanctuary for his crimes before being abandoned. The sheer geography of his activity, spanning from Houston to Pasadena, masked the connection between the growing number of missing persons reports. As 1971 unfolded, the disappearances became more frequent and more coordinated. Victims often vanished after attending gatherings or small parties orchestrated by Henley and Brooks, lured by the promise of easy money or simple camaraderie. Names like James Glass, Danny Yates, and Randall Johnson were added to the files. These were not random acts. They were targeted disappearances, enabled by the complete psychological control Corll wielded over his recruiters. The families of these victims were often given false hope or met with bureaucratic indifference, as police struggled to connect a teenager vanishing in Pasadena with another who disappeared miles away in Heights. There was no single, unified pattern that immediately alerted officials to the presence of a single, highly active predator. The terror reached a frightening peak in 1972 and 1973. The scale of the violence meant that Corll was constantly dealing with the immense logistical challenge of disposal. This required him to acquire various off-site locations specifically for concealment. The discovery of numerous shallow graves was a dark testament to the geography of his crimes. He used remote areas, including a desolate field in Chambers County, and most notoriously, a rented storage unit, a quiet, unremarkable metal shed where the remains of multiple victims were eventually interred. This reliance on storage units and rental properties highlights Corll's methodical, almost managerial approach to mass murder, ensuring that no single location would hold all the evidence necessary to implicate him early on. Among the victims who disappeared during this final frantic period were Mark Scott, Billy Balch, William "Billy" Lawrence, and Raymond Hamilton, the latter being a close friend of Henley's. A devastating illustration of how deeply entrenched Henley was in Corll's mechanism of destruction. The fact that Henley was luring his own friends speaks volumes about the level of fear and psychological bondage Corll had established. The constant presence of Corll's 2 young assistants during this period turned them into silent, unwilling witnesses to a hidden war waged against the youth of Houston. The chronology came to an abrupt, violent halt in the early hours of August 8, 1973. Corll had invited Henley and a young female acquaintance, Sharon, to his residence for a gathering. A violent confrontation erupted, details of which are still highly debated. What is undisputed is that the years of psychological pressure and fear finally broke. Elmer Wayne Henley, fearing for his own life, managed to gain control of a firearm. In a moment of chaotic, desperate self-preservation, Henley shot and killed Dean Corll, the man who had controlled his existence for years.
Mama.
Who's this?
It's Wayne.
Yes, this is Mama, baby.
Mama,
Huh?
I killed Dean.
Wayne?
Ma'am?
What are you doing?
Yes.
Oh, God. Where are you?
It's all right. It's all right. It's all right.
Where are you?
I'm out of his warehouse.
Where?
Out of that warehouse he keeps.
Can I come out there?
Yeah, yes. No.
It's on the Highland Park.
She can't. No, you can't come. I'm with the police, Mama.
Wayne showed police the mass graves on the beach.
This sudden, bloody climax was the only reason the nightmare finally ended. The subsequent hours were defined by disbelief. Henley, immediately after the shooting, confessed to police, not just to the act of killing Corll, but to the existence of dozens of victims. He led stunned police officials to the various burial sites, the infamous boat storage unit, the desolate beaches, and the remote wooded areas. The scope of the confession, the sheer number of names and the methodical detail of the concealment was simply too staggering for the investigators to immediately grasp. The quiet horror that had festered in Houston's suburbs was finally revealed to the world, turning the names of the missing, like Marty Jones and Stephen Lawson, into symbols of a monumental, terrifying tragedy. The story of Dean Corll had ended, but the agonizing process of identifying the victims and understanding the dark complicity had just begun.
Open it up.
How do you feel, Henley? Come here, Wayne.
The words of the police chief offered little consolation to the families of the victims in the mass murders. The chief did say his department and other law enforcement agencies are continuing their investigation. There will be more digging for graves, and there will be more grief as additional victims are identified. George Lewis, NBC News, Houston.
The aftermath quickly shifted from discovery to a legal and moral crisis. Elmer Wayne Henley was arrested and ultimately charged with 6 counts of murder. His defense hinged on the argument of coercion and psychological terror, claiming he acted under the constant threat of Corll and committed the final act in self-defense. David Brooks, the other accomplice, was also arrested and charged, and later testified against Henley in exchange for a lighter sentence, having pleaded guilty to his involvement in the crimes. The trials, which took place in the mid-1970s, were highly scrutinized, forcing the courts to grapple with the complex dynamics of psychological abuse and complicity in mass violence. Ultimately, both Henley and Brooks were convicted. Henley received 6 life sentences, a fate that sealed his life within the walls of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. The true legacy of the Houston mass murders, however, extended far beyond the convictions. The case exposed devastating systemic failures within law enforcement. The initial dismissal of victims as runaways, often due to their transient social status, was revealed as a catastrophic oversight that allowed Corll to operate with impunity for years. The subsequent outcry led to significant, much-needed reforms in how missing persons cases involving young people were handled across the state of Texas. The tragedy forced communities to look critically at the invisible dangers lurking in suburban life and the devastating consequences of social apathy. The names of the young men who disappeared, the vanishing generation, became a somber reminder of a moment when one man's concealed malice shattered the illusion of safety in a thriving American city. The wounds left by the Candyman remain deep within Houston's history. The subsequent sentencing marked the final, judicial end to the most intense chapter of this tragic story. After years of terror, the system, however belatedly, found a way to contain the trauma and assign accountability. Elmer Wayne Henley was confined, left to face the consequences of his complicity and the terrible shadow of the man who controlled him.